Hey everyone, today I want to show you a demo of Managed Sync, which is a new kind of pipeline in Paragon that allows you to sync data out of your users' integration sources into your application. So, for example, if you're building a RAG application that needs a lot of context from different integrations, you can ingest files from your users' knowledge sources like Google Drive or Box or SharePoint and bring that critical context into your LLM applications. You can also use Managed Sync to bring in structured data into your application and run powerful analytical queries that are easier to run when you have a local replica as opposed to relying on integration APIs. So for example, if you're replicating CRM data, you can use Managed Sync to bring a copy over to your app to enrich and query on that data more powerfully than you'd be able to do just accessing the API. One more thing about sync, we enforce all of permissions about the synced data for every user in the application. So you can query what users have access to which synced objects once it ends up in your application. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. But just to frame exactly how this will work inside of your app, Paragon will ingest all of these different integrations and sources that your users connect in a normalized sync API that allows you to have a uniform interface between your application and all the different sources that your users may have. So for example, for file storage, we have a standard object type called a file and a folder that will give you standard properties over each of those objects as they get synced into your application. So if you integrate once into the file storage category, you won't have to worry about all of the different nuances of each connector like Google Drive, SharePoint, and Box. You just access it as the standard file object that Paragon offers, and you can get support for all of the other file storage integrations that we offer out of the box. For things like CRM, we also offer different standard fields that are common across a number of different CRM integrations, but we always give you access to custom fields. So for any fields that don't quite fit into our schema, you're able to both customize the schemas that we offer, but also you'll be able to access any of those fields in one standard object as they're synced in to Paragon. So today I'll go over two different types of APIs. One is called Sync API, which actually allows you to enable a sync on behalf of a user, start pulling in related records. And then second, I'll go over Permissions API, which is a way that you can use to check and enforce access and role-based access controls over the data that you've synced. So let me jump into the Sync API. So what I'll do is I'm going to enable a sync for a Google Drive account that I have over here. This is a kind of a test Google Drive account that I have that has a few documents. And what I'm going to do is essentially replicate these documents into my application by enabling a sync. So let's go ahead and give it a try. I've added a Paragon user token here, which represents my connection to Paragon for a specific user. So in the background, I've already connected that Google Drive account to this user represented by this Paragon user token. So I'm going to enable this integration for Google Drive, and the type of pipeline we're syncing is files. So go ahead and start that. You can see I get back a response that says that the status of the sync is now initializing. I can use the ID of the sync that was returned to essentially track the sync status over time. So I'll use the get sync status endpoint to check in on my sync and see how things are progressing. You can see that right now it hasn't pulled in any records yet, but as the sync progresses, this summary count will increase. So as you can see, the sync has now completed and is showing 26 records synced out of 26. I can also verify that in a webhook that I received, that this sync has completed, and it will tell me when it completed and how many records it was able to sync. So you'll start receiving webhooks from the Sync API about different events that happen, including when sync's complete, and also after the initial sync is complete, you'll start to receive updates about when new records are created or updated. But now that I have the initial sync complete for this Google Drive file sync, I'll go ahead and fetch those records from the pull synced records endpoint. So I'll plug in the sync ID that I have here and start pulling in the files. And you can see that all of those files that I showed you in the previous tab are now available as different standard file objects that I can query in this paginated records API. I can use any of these IDs to then download the content, the specific content of each of those files, and index them into my application. For example, if this is the start of your RAG pipeline, you would start to page over the synced records that have been created or synced in Paragon, and then you'll be able to pull in the content using this download content endpoint. Let me grab the sync ID again. And then what I can do is I can basically take this endpoint, and I can't test the exact endpoint inside of this API doc. So I'm just going to go ahead and download that file. It's going to go ahead and download, and let me go ahead and pop that open. You can see here that this document corresponds to the same doc that I had synced from my Google Drive account here. So there's a file representation of this Google Doc that has been exported and then pulled by the Sync API. Like I mentioned, once I have the sync enabled, I'll start getting updates when records update. So I can go back into my AI strategy doc and I can make a few quick updates. So I can go ahead and say this needs review at Ethan. And once I do that, I should be able to see the corresponding update appear in my webhook. So you can see here that it sent me a record updated event with the ID of the file that we had just updated. Importantly, all of these file storage syncs are normalized. So like I said, all the file storage syncs will always give you back a file that corresponds to this object structure, which you can use to pull the related records with the same endpoints. So even if I just created this sync for Google Drive specifically, I can just as easily switch this to a different integration in the same category, like Box. So I'll go ahead and enable it for Box in the same way. I'll get back a different sync ID, but I can pull the status and the synced records in exactly the same way. So you can see here that similarly, my Box sync is now active. It's starting to enumerate the files in my Box account and pull them in the same way that I was doing with Google Drive. So you can see here that here are some of the example files that were in my Box account as well. So on top of all of these endpoints that you have for enabling syncs, I wanted to also cover the permissions API, which actually allows you to make sure that you can take the replicated data that you have access to and enforce the correct permissions over that data. So what I'm going to show you is a little bit of a debugger for the permissions API that we have. So here you see a schema for the Google Drive permissions model, and it's very complex, but this is how Google Drive enforces permissions, and there's all these relationships that you can inherit from. And luckily, Paragon automatically indexes all of the relationships between the files, folders, groups, and users that are related in the synced files that you've downloaded. So you can start asking questions like, who is related? I can ask who is related to Google Drive file by the previous ID we had as can read. And this question essentially will resolve all of the dependencies to that question and ask who has access to the parent folders, who has direct access to the file, and return you with a list of users who should have access to a particular file. So you can see it's a little bit tricky to see the answer to this question, but it will give you a list back of all of the users that should have access to that file by email. And maybe if for a simpler question, I can ask who is the owner of this file, and you can see that it's the creator of the file who has owner access. So we make this very easy by providing a permissions API that allows you to check access for a given object, user, and role. And we will manage behind the scenes all of these relationships between all of the different integration-specific roles and permissions that every integration implements to make it simple for you to prevent unintended access to different files that you may replicate into your application. So that's managed sync in a nutshell. As a reminder, you can use this to ingest knowledge sources for RAG in a secure way, both by bringing critical context into your app while enforcing the right permissions. While you do that, Paragon will automatically handle sync scheduling and error recovery for high volume sync, like handling rate limiting errors and making sure that the ingestion is performant. We'll also normalize all of that ingested data into a configurable schema, which I showed you earlier, which is a standardized object model for each category of integrations that we provide. And then finally, of course, we permission all of that ingested data to make sure that the APIs that you're using don't unintentionally expose access to users that shouldn't have access to the files that you've synced. So really excited to see what you build with this. We think this will really help build contextual LLM apps, and I'm excited to see your feedback. Thanks.